Lady Eleanor Vance was the most valuable jewel in the post-war London season of 1947, a fact that brought her no joy. If you believe in our mission to unearth these forgotten histories, consider supporting us with a super thanks. And if you already stand with Eleanor, leave a "Stay strong, Eleanor" in the comments below. Tonight, she was on display in her own home, Avington Park, a sprawling stone monument to 1,000 years of her family's uninterrupted power. The occasion was a charity ball for war orphans, an event designed to showcase the enduring generosity and relevance of an aristocracy that felt the modern world closing in like a cold fog. The great ballroom glittered with crystal and old money, a frantic, almost desperate gaiety that failed to conceal the scent of decay beneath the expensive perfume. Eleanor moved through the crowd with a practiced, languid grace, a smile fixed on her lips that did not reach her eyes. She was a work of art, her gown a cascade of pale silk, the famous Avington diamonds a cold, heavy weight around her neck. She was also a commodity. Every polite conversation, every shared dance was a negotiation. She was the prize, and the men who orbited her were the bidders. They were the richest, most powerful scions of England's great industrial and land-owning families, men who saw marriage not as a union of souls, but as a merger of dynasties. She had, to the growing despair of her father, the Duke, already rejected 3 of them. There was Lord Ashworth, who owned half of the steel mills in Sheffield and spoke of love with the same dull enthusiasm he used to discuss ore prices. There was Sir Giles Croft, whose family had made a fortune in colonial tea and who still looked at the world as a map of territories to be conquered and owned. And tonight, the final and most persistent of her suitors was Lord Harrington. Harrington was handsome, impeccably dressed, and possessed of a confidence so absolute it bordered on a pathology. He cornered her near the French doors that led to the terrace, his presence a proprietary claim. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a low, possessive murmur, "my father and the Duke had a most productive chat this evening. The combining of our estates would create a land trust of unparalleled influence in the north. He was not proposing marriage, he was proposing a corporate takeover." He looked at her not with affection, but with the cool, appraising eye of a man admiring a prize-winning thoroughbred he was about to acquire. "I am sure it would be a most efficient arrangement, my lord," Eleanor said, her voice a cool, polished shield. "But I fear my heart is not a parcel of land to be annexed for the greater good of a portfolio." Harrington's smile tightened. Her quiet, persistent defiance was a novelty to him, an amusing but temporary obstacle. "Your heart, my dear, will learn its duty," he said, a silken threat in his voice, "as we all must." Eleanor felt a familiar, suffocating wave of despair. This was her future, a life sentence of polite smiles and quiet duty, her own soul a forgotten, dusty room in the grand house of her husband's ambitions. She needed air. With a soft, murmured excuse, she slipped away from Harrington and stepped out onto the wide stone terrace. The cool night air was a relief. The manicured gardens of Avington Park stretched away into the darkness, a silent, orderly kingdom. But her solitude was not complete. Standing at a discreet distance near the stone balustrade was a soldier. He was part of a small, ceremonial honor guard from a distinguished West Indies regiment, invited to the ball to add a touch of patriotic color, a living symbol of the empire's loyal subjects who had helped win the war. They were treated not as guests, but as decorations, stoic, silent men in immaculate uniforms, their dark skin a stark contrast to the pale, powdered faces of the aristocracy. This soldier, however, was not standing at stiff attention. He was in a relaxed, watchful stance, his gaze directed not at the party but out at the dark, silent park. He was tall and lean, his uniform impeccably pressed, his bearing one of quiet, unassuming dignity. He seemed utterly unimpressed by the glittering spectacle behind him, a man who had seen the world's true face and found this one wanting. He turned his head slightly as she approached, his eyes meeting hers. There was no deference in his gaze, no awe. There was only a calm, intelligent watchfulness. In a room full of men who looked at her as if she were a prize, he was the first to look at her as if she were simply a person. "It's a beautiful night, Sergeant," she said, her voice a little breathless. "It is, my lady," he replied, his voice a low, gentle baritone with the melodic cadence of the islands, though it is a strange thing to see so much light inside when the rest of the world is still so dark. His words were a perfect, unadorned expression of the very thought that had been suffocating her. He saw it too, the falseness, the desperate, glittering pretense. In that single, shared observation, a silent, invisible bridge was built between them, across the vast, unbridgeable chasm of race, class, and wealth. She, the Duke's daughter, and he, the colonial soldier, were the only two people at this party who were not performing. "My name is Eleanor," she said softly. "Sergeant Isaac Thorne," he replied with a slight formal nod. Before she could say more, the French doors opened and Lord Harrington stepped out onto the terrace, his face a mask of possessive annoyance. "Eleanor, there you are," he said, his voice sharp. "The Duke is looking for you. We are about to toast the fund." He did not so much as glance at Sergeant Thorne, dismissing him with an aristocratic indifference more profound than any insult. He held out his arm, expecting her to take it. And in that moment, something inside Eleanor, something that had been quietly fraying for years, finally snapped. She looked at Harrington's arrogant, entitled face. She looked at the prison of a future he was offering her, a future of efficient arrangements and learned duty. And then she looked at Sergeant Isaac Thorne, a man of quiet dignity, a man who had seen the darkness and still knew how to speak the truth. She made a choice. It was not a reasoned, logical choice. It was an act of pure, instinctual rebellion, a desperate, reckless bid for her own soul. She turned her back on Lord Harrington. She ignored his outstretched arm, his sputtering, indignant protest. She walked the few steps to where Sergeant Thorne stood, the diamonds around her neck glittering like captured stars in the lamplight. She stood before him, so close she could see the faint, weary lines around his eyes. The entire party, it seemed, had spilled out onto the terrace behind her, a silent, shocked audience drawn by the drama of her public rejection of the most eligible man in England. She leaned in close, her lips almost touching his ear, and she whispered. It was not a declaration of love. It was not a plea for rescue. It was a statement of fact, a truth so sharp and so dangerous it was a weapon. "Of all the men in this room, Sergeant," she whispered, her voice a fierce, trembling current of defiance, "you are the only one who is not for sale." A collective, scandalized gasp rippled through the crowd of aristocrats behind her. Lord Harrington's face turned a shade of mottled purple. Her father, the Duke, looked as if he had been struck by lightning. She had not just rejected a suitor, she had rejected their entire world, their values, their currency. She had held up the quiet dignity of a colonial soldier as a thing more valuable than all their land, all their titles, all their wealth. She had committed an act of social treason, and the shockwave was about to bring the glittering, fragile world of Avington Park crashing down around them all. The silence on the terrace was a living entity, a shocked, breathless vacuum that pulled every eye toward the impossible tableau at its center. The Duke's daughter, the jewel of the season, her lips inches from the ear of a black colonial soldier. Her whispered words, though intended only for him, had been overheard by those closest to the scene, and now they spread through the crowd like a lit match dropped on dry tinder. The initial collective gasp was followed by a low, venomous murmur, a sound of outrage, of disbelief, of a world whose sacred, unspoken rules had just been flagrantly violated. Sergeant Isaac Thorne stood perfectly still, a statue in the heart of the hurricane. He had been in firefights, had faced down bayonet charges, but nothing had prepared him for the pinpoint surgical strike of Lady Eleanor Vance's words. He felt the heat of 100 pairs of hostile eyes on his back, the sudden intense pressure of being the unwilling focal point of a scandal he had no part in creating. He was a soldier, a man trained to anticipate threats, but this was a form of combat for which he had no training. It was a social ambush, and he was the collateral damage. Lord Harrington was the first to recover. His face, which had been a mask of purple rage, now settled into a cold, reptilian fury. He strode forward, his movements stiff with wounded pride, and planted himself directly in front of Eleanor. his body a physical barrier between her and Isaac. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a low, dangerous hiss, each word a clipped, precise instrument of contempt. "Have you taken leave of your senses? You will come inside with me. Now, this embarrassing little theatrical display is over." He reached for her arm, his intention to physically escort her from the scene, to reassert his ownership, to erase this moment of madness from the public record. But Eleanor, who had for so long been a creature of quiet, passive resistance, had been transformed. Her act of rebellion had unleashed a strength in her she had not known she possessed. She pulled her arm back, away from his grasp, a small, sharp movement of defiance that was as shocking to the crowd as her initial whisper. "I'm not going anywhere with you, my lord," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing out across the silent terrace. She did not look at him. Her eyes were still on Isaac, a look of desperate, almost wild appeal. She had jumped off the cliff, and now she was looking to see if he would be her water below. The Duke, her father, a man whose entire life was a performance of stoic, aristocratic duty, finally moved. He strode onto the terrace, his face a thundercloud, his movements those of a man trying to contain a wildfire. He did not go to his daughter. He went straight to Isaac. "Sergeant," the Duke said, his voice a low, guttural command, "your presence here is no longer required. You and your men will return to your barracks immediately." It was an order, a dismissal. He was attempting to remove the catalyst, to erase the object of his daughter's insane transgression. Isaac, a soldier in the presence of a duke, a man who represented the very apex of the imperial power he served, did the only thing he could do. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight. He gave a sharp, formal salute. "Yes, Your Grace," he said, his voice a model of military discipline. He turned to leave. He was a soldier. He followed orders. This was not his fight. He had been an innocent bystander caught in the crossfire of a battle between the gilded cages of the aristocracy. But as he turned, Eleanor's voice, now laced with a raw, desperate panic, cut through the air. "No," she cried. "If he leaves, I leave with him." The words were a second, even more powerful explosion. It was one thing to make a symbolic, whispered statement. It was another thing entirely to threaten to abandon her home, her family, her entire world, for a man she had just met, a man so far beneath her station that he might as well have been from another planet. This was no longer a moment of madness. This was a declaration of war. The Duke looked at his daughter as if she were a stranger, a changeling who had taken the place of his quiet, obedient child. "Eleanor," he said, his voice trembling with a rage he could no longer contain, "you will not speak another word. You will go to your room. We will discuss your illness in the morning." "I am not ill, father," she said, her voice now quiet but filled with a chilling certainty. "I am, for the first time in my life, awake." She took a step toward Isaac, who had frozen, trapped between his duty to obey and the impossible unspoken plea in her eyes. "Sergeant Thorne," she said, her voice now a formal, almost regal command of its own. "You are a soldier of the king. I'm the daughter of the Duke of Avington. I'm in a state of distress. I'm asking for your escort from these premises. Are you going to refuse me?" She had done it with a breathtaking, intuitive brilliance. She had framed her request not as a personal, romantic whim, but as a matter of duty. She had placed him in an impossible position. To obey the Duke would be to abandon a lady in distress, a violation of a code of chivalry that was as much a part of his soldier's training as his drill. To obey her would be to commit an act of open, public insubordination against a man who could have him court-martialed with a single phone call. Isaac stood at the crossroads of 1,000 years of English-class history. He looked at the Duke's furious, apoplectic face. He looked at Lord Harrington's sneering, hateful glare. He looked at the sea of pale, scandalized faces of the English elite, an entire class united in their outrage at this unthinkable breach of protocol. And then he looked at Lady Eleanor Vance. He saw not an aristocrat, but a fellow prisoner, a woman who was fighting for her own kind of freedom with the only weapons she had. He saw the desperate, terrifying courage in her eyes, and he, a man who had been trained to recognize courage in all its forms, made his choice. He turned back to the Duke. "Your Grace," he said, his voice calm and respectful, but with an unshakable core of iron. With all due respect, my duty as a soldier of the king is to the crown and its subjects. Lady Eleanor is a subject of the crown, and she has made a direct request for my assistance. I cannot refuse her." He then turned to Eleanor, his expression unreadable. "My lady," he said, "where would you like to go?" The collective gasp that followed was the sound of a world breaking. A black colonial sergeant had just defied a duke in his own home, on his own terrace, in front of the entire upper crust of English society. It was an act of insubordination so profound, so unthinkable, that it seemed to momentarily paralyze everyone. Eleanor did not hesitate. "Take me to the train station in the village," she said, her voice clear and strong. She had no plan, no destination. She only knew she had to leave. Without another word, Isaac turned. He offered his arm to her, a gesture of formal, old-world courtesy that was, in this context, the most revolutionary act of the night. After a moment's hesitation, she took it. Her gloved hand on the rough wool of his uniform sleeve was a silent, public sealing of their insane, impossible alliance. Together they began to walk, not running but walking with a slow, deliberate grace, right through the heart of the stunned, silent crowd. The guests parted before them as if they were lepers, their faces a mixture of horror and a kind of fascinated, scandalized awe. They were watching the performance of their lives, the public immolation of a dynasty. Lord Harrington, his face a mask of pure hatred, made one last desperate move. He stepped in front of them, blocking their path. "You will not take another step," he snarled at Isaac. "You are a dead man, Sergeant. I will see you court-martialed. I will see you rot in a military prison." Isaac stopped. He looked at the furious aristocrat before him. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a threat. He simply looked at him, and in his eyes was the quiet, chilling authority of a man who had seen real death, who had faced real enemies, and who found this pampered, titled boy to be a thing of utter, pathetic inconsequence. "Step aside, my lord," Isaac said, his voice a low, quiet command. "This is not your affair." Indeed, there was something in his voice, in his absolute lack of fear, that made Harrington flinch. For the first time in his life, the young lord was faced with a man his power could not touch, his threats could not intimidate. He hesitated for a split second, and in that moment of hesitation, his power was broken. Isaac and Eleanor simply walked around him, leaving him standing there, a sputtering, impotent monument to his own irrelevance. They walked through the grand ballroom, their footsteps echoing on the polished floor. They walked through the cavernous entrance hall, past the disapproving eyes of the painted ancestors. They walked out the front door, leaving the warmth and the light and the glittering, suffocating world of Avington Park behind them. Isaac led her not to the main drive, but down a small servant's path that wound its way through the dark gardens. He was leading her toward the back of the estate, toward the service entrance, toward the world of the invisible people who made the grand illusion of Avington Park possible. They did not speak. There were no words for what had just happened. Eleanor's mind was a whirlwind. She had just thrown a bomb into the heart of her own life, and she had no idea what she would find in the wreckage. She was terrified. She was exhilarated. She was, for the first time, free. They reached a small, cobbled courtyard behind the main house near the kitchens. An army truck, a drab, olive-green vehicle that was used to transport the ceremonial guard, was parked in the shadows. Isaac's men, the other soldiers of the honor guard, were waiting, their faces a mixture of confusion and a deep, worried respect for their sergeant. Isaac opened the passenger door of the truck. "It is not a carriage, my lady," he said, a faint, ironic smile touching his lips for the first time. "It is the most beautiful carriage I have ever seen," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. He helped her up into the high seat. As he was about to close the door, a figure emerged from the shadows of the kitchen. It was Mrs. Davies, the head housekeeper, a woman who had served Eleanor's family for 40 years, a woman who had been a second mother to her. The old woman's face was a mess of tears and a fierce, protective love. She thrust a thick woolen traveling cloak and a small, heavy purse into Eleanor's hands. "You'll need this, my lamb," she whispered, her voice a choked sob. "God go with you." She then pressed a small, warm package into Isaac's hand. "For the road," she said. It was a loaf of freshly baked bread. This small, simple act of kindness, of loyalty from below stairs, was more moving to Eleanor than any grand gesture she had ever known. It was a sign that in this house there was still a place where honor and love were the true currency. Isaac got into the driver's seat. He started the engine. The rough, unrefined roar of the army truck, a defiant, vulgar shout in the aristocratic silence of the night. He drove them out of the service gate and onto the dark country lane, away from the glittering, dying world of Avington Park, toward a future that was a complete and terrifying unknown. The army truck was a world away from the silent, upholstered luxury Eleanor had known her entire life. It was a purely functional machine, smelling of canvas, diesel, and the faint metallic scent of hard use. The ride was rough, every rut and pothole in the country lane, a jarring physical reminder of her violent departure from the smooth, paved roads of her own existence. She sat stiffly in the high passenger seat, the unfamiliar wool of the traveling cloak clutched around her shoulders. The heavy purse Mrs. Davies had given her a solid, reassuring weight in her lap. Beside her, Sergeant Isaac Thorne drove with a quiet, focused concentration, his hands steady on the large steering wheel. The other soldiers of his unit sat in the open back of the truck, silent, disciplined figures who were now, through no fault of their own, accomplices in the social crime of the century. The only sound in the cab was the rough, grinding roar of the engine and the squeak of the windshield wipers pushing away the light, persistent drizzle. The silence between them was not awkward, but dense with unspoken questions. Eleanor's mind was a maelstrom. She had acted on a single pure impulse of rebellion, a desperate instinctual leap for freedom. But now, in the cold, rattling reality of the truck, the consequences of that leap began to descend upon her. She had abandoned her family, her home, her name. She had thrown her entire world into chaos, and she had, in her own selfish bid for freedom, dragged this quiet, honorable soldier into the heart of her own personal war. "Sergeant," she began, her voice a little unsteady, "I must apologize. I have placed you in an impossible position. What I did back there, it was reckless. I did not consider the consequences for you." Isaac did not take his eyes off the dark, winding road. "My lady," he said, his voice calm, measured, "a man is not a stone. He is not a tree. He is a collection of the choices he makes. You made a choice on that terrace, and I made mine. I am a sergeant in the King's army. I am responsible for my own actions." His words were a quiet, firm refusal of her apology. He was not her victim. He was not a pawn in her game. He was a man who had made a conscious decision, and he was prepared to face the consequences of it. In that simple, declarative statement, he gave her the one thing no one else had ever given her, the respect of treating her as an equal, a fellow actor on the stage of her own life, responsible for her own choices. "What will they do to you?" she asked, the fear for him now a sharp, painful knot in her stomach. "I have disobeyed a direct order from a duke," he said, his tone matter of fact, as if he were reciting an article from a military manual. "I have, in the eyes of my superiors, aided a member of the aristocracy in a public scandal. I will be confined to barracks upon my return. There will be an inquiry. I will most likely be court-martialed, stripped of my rank, and dishonorably discharged. Lord Harrington will see to it. He is not a man who will let such a public humiliation go unanswered." The stark, brutal reality of his words was a physical blow. She had not just inconvenienced him, she had destroyed his career, his honor, his entire future. The weight of her own recklessness was a crushing, suffocating thing. "There must be something I can do," she said, her voice a desperate plea. "I will speak to my father. I will explain." "With all due respect, my lady," he interrupted, his voice gentle but firm, "I do not believe the Duke is in a frame of mind to listen to your explanations at the moment. The damage is done. The only thing to do now is to face what comes. They drove on in silence for a time, the truck's headlights cutting a lonely yellow path through the dark, sleeping countryside. Eleanor opened the small, heavy purse Mrs. Davies had given her. Inside, she found a thick wad of banknotes, a small, shocking fortune, and a single, heavy, old-fashioned key. It was the key to a small cottage on the estate, a place where her mother had sometimes gone for solitude, a place Eleanor had not visited in years. The housekeeper had not just given her money, she had given her a sanctuary, a place to hide. She also unwrapped the small package Mrs. Davies had given to Isaac. It was, as she had suspected, a fresh, warm loaf of bread. The simple, earthy smell of it filled the cab, a scent of home, of kindness, of a world far removed from the cold, glittering pretense of the ballroom. She broke off a piece and offered it to him. He took it with a small, grateful nod. They ate in silence, a strange shared communion in the rattling, diesel-fumed intimacy of the truck. They reached the small market town that was their destination just before dawn. The train station was a small, sleepy brick building, its windows still dark. Isaac pulled the truck to a stop in a deserted side street. "This is as far as I can take you, my lady," he said, turning to face her for the first time. In the pale, pre-dawn light, she could see the profound weariness in his eyes. "The first train to London leaves in an hour. From there you can go anywhere." He was leaving her. He was delivering her to safety, and then he was going back to face the consequences, to face his own destruction. The thought was unbearable. "And you," she asked, her voice a whisper, "you will go back to your barracks? To your court-martial?" "I am a soldier," he said simply, as if that explained everything. "I will face my tribunal." She looked at him, at this man of quiet, unshakable honor, a man who was willing to sacrifice his entire life for a principle, for a single choice he had made on a dark terrace. And she knew she could not let him do it. She had started this fire. She could not walk away and let him be the only one who was burned. She thought of the money in her purse. She thought of the key, and a new plan, as reckless and as desperate as her first, began to form in her mind. "You are not going back, Sergeant," she said, her voice suddenly finding a new, clear strength. "You and your men, you are all now accomplices in my abduction." She used the word with a deliberate, ironic weight. "If you go back, you will all be punished. Lord Harrington will see to that. He will make an example of you to prove a point to me, to my father." Isaac watched her, his expression unreadable as the new, audacious reality of what she was proposing slowly dawned on him. "But if you do not go back," she continued, her mind racing, the plan taking shape as she spoke, "if you and your men were to simply disappear for a time, the story changes. It is no longer a matter of a disobedient soldier. It becomes a matter of a runaway duchess and her band of loyal, perhaps misguided protectors. It becomes a scandal of a different, more romantic and politically far more complicated nature. My father, the Duke, is a proud man. He will not want the world to see him as a man who could not control his own daughter, a man whose authority was so weak that an entire squad of colonial soldiers could simply walk away with her. He will want to contain this. He will want to handle it quietly." She was speaking his language now, the language of strategy, of tactics, of understanding your enemy. "You and your men are on temporary assignment here," she continued. "Your regiment is due to be shipped out, back to the West Indies, in a month. If you can stay hidden for that month, if you can avoid the military police and my father's men, you can slip out of the country. You can go home, not as disgraced, court-martialed soldiers, but as men who have simply completed their tour of duty." It was a wild, almost insane plan. It would require them to become fugitives, to live in hiding, to evade a manhunt that would be led by the combined forces of the military and one of the most powerful aristocrats in England. "And where, my lady?" Isaac asked, his voice a low, skeptical rumble. "Do you propose that a sergeant and his 8 men, all of whom are, as you may have noticed, of a rather conspicuous complexion, hide for a month in the English countryside?" She held up the heavy iron key. "I have a place," she said, a small, triumphant smile touching her lips. A place no one would ever think to look. A place that belongs to me. He stared at her, at the key, at the fierce, intelligent light that had come into her eyes. He had thought he was rescuing a damsel in distress, a fragile, beautiful creature from a gilded cage, but he was beginning to realize that he had allied himself with something far more formidable. He was in the presence of a natural-born general, a woman who, when cornered, did not surrender, but instead devised a brilliant and unexpected counterattack. He thought of his men sitting in the back of the truck, their own futures now hanging in the balance, tied to his own. He thought of the grim, joyless certainty of a court-martial, of the years in a military prison, and he thought of this strange, courageous, and utterly unpredictable woman who was offering him not just a chance to escape, but a chance to fight back. He made his second choice of the night. It was as reckless and as life-altering as the first. "Very well, my lady," he said, a slow, wry smile spreading across his own face. "It seems I am under your command." He turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. He did not drive toward the train station. He turned the truck around and drove them back into the dark, misty heart of the English countryside, toward a new and even more dangerous chapter of their shared rebellion. The cottage was a secret place, a memory from a forgotten chapter of Eleanor's life. Tucked away in a secluded, overgrown corner of the vast Avington estate, miles from the great house, it had been her mother's refuge, a small, stone-built sanctuary where the Duchess, a woman of quiet, artistic sensibilities, had escaped the suffocating formality of her own life. After her mother's death years ago, the cottage had been locked and left to the mercy of the ivy and the field mice, its existence all but forgotten by the Duke and the estate staff. For Eleanor, it had been a place of childish ghost stories and whispered legends. Now, it was to be their fortress. They approached it at dawn, the army truck lumbering down a narrow, nearly impassable lane, the branches of ancient, untrimmed trees scraping against its canvas top. Isaac drove with a slow, cautious skill, his men walking ahead, clearing fallen branches from the path. When the cottage finally came into view, nestled in a small, misty valley by a babbling brook, it looked like a place that had been lost to time. Ivy covered the stone walls in a thick, green mantle, and the slate roof was patched with moss. It was a place that had perfected the art of being invisible. The old iron key turned stiffly in the lock, the sound of the tumblers a loud, grating protest in the morning silence. Isaac pushed the heavy oak door open, and they stepped inside, into a world of dust and shadows. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone, decaying paper, and the faint, ghostly perfume of dried lavender. Everything was covered in a shroud of white dust cloths, the furniture preserved like sleeping giants, but beneath the neglect there was a sense of enduring, unconventional beauty. The main room was dominated by a huge stone fireplace. Bookshelves, filled with volumes of poetry and art history, lined the walls. A grand piano, its keys yellowed with age, stood in one corner. It was not the home of a duchess. It was the home of an artist, a dreamer. For Isaac and his men, it was a palace. Compared to the stark, impersonal functionality of their barracks, this small, forgotten cottage was a place of impossible, eccentric luxury. But they were soldiers, not guests. Their training immediately took over. Under Isaac's quiet, efficient command, they transformed the cottage from a sleeping relic into a defensible outpost. One man was posted as a lookout on the ridge that overlooked the valley, his position concealed in a thicket of gorse. Another was tasked with scouting the surrounding woods, mapping out escape routes. The others set to work. They cleared the overgrown garden, uncovering a patch of hardy winter vegetables. They repaired the leaky roof. They chopped firewood from a fallen oak and soon had a warm, crackling fire in the great stone hearth, the first fire that had warmed the cottage in a decade. Eleanor, too, found a new and unexpected purpose. She was no longer Lady Eleanor Vance, the decorative centerpiece of a great house. She was a quartermaster, a strategist, a member of a small besieged platoon. She shed her ruined silk ball gown and donned a simple, practical dress she found in one of her mother's old wardrobes. She directed the men to the stores of canned goods, preserves, and smoked meats that her mother, a woman who had lived through 2 wars, had kept meticulously stocked in the cottage's deep, cool pantry. In the shared, necessary work of survival, the rigid, invisible walls of class and race began to dissolve. They were no longer an aristocrat and a group of colonial soldiers. They were a single, cohesive unit, bound together by a shared danger and a common goal. The men, who had at first been stiff and formal in her presence, began to relax. They were a cheerful, resilient lot, their quiet professionalism punctuated by easy laughter and the melodic, lilting cadence of their island accents. They treated her not with the deference due to a lady of title, but with the warm, respectful camaraderie due to a trusted commanding officer. Isaac was the quiet, undisputed center of their small world. He moved with a calm, efficient grace, his authority absolute but never asserted. He was a natural leader, a man who commanded loyalty not through fear, but through the quiet, unshakable force of his own competence and integrity. Eleanor watched him, fascinated. She had been surrounded her entire life by men who postured and preened, who mistook arrogance for strength. Isaac possessed a strength that was so deep and so innate that it required no performance. He simply was. Their first few days in the cottage were a period of strange, almost idyllic peace. The world outside, the world of angry dukes and vengeful lords, seemed a distant, half-remembered dream. They worked during the day, and in the evenings, they would gather around the fire. Isaac would read aloud from the books of poetry on the shelves, his deep, gentle voice giving a new life to the old words. One of the men, a corporal named Sam, had brought a guitar, and he would play the soft, melancholic songs of his homeland, his music filling the small cottage with a sweet, aching beauty. But they all knew their peace was a fragile, temporary thing. The storm was gathering and they were in its eye. The first sign of the outside world came a week into their seclusion. The lookout on the ridge spotted a group of men on horseback, fanning out across the estate lands. They were the Duke's groundskeepers and gamekeepers, a small private army who knew every inch of this land. The manhunt had begun. Isaac immediately tightened their security. All work outside the cottage was to cease. No fires were to be lit during the daylight hours, the smoke a potential beacon. Their world shrank to the 4 stone walls of their hiding place. The idyllic peace was replaced by a tense, watchful silence. The search parties drew closer. Twice, they heard the sound of men's voices and the barking of dogs in the woods nearby. They would all freeze, their hearts pounding until the sounds faded away. The psychological pressure was immense. They were prisoners in their own sanctuary. It was during this period of intense, close-quarters confinement that the last of the barriers between Eleanor and Isaac finally fell. One evening, as they sat alone by the dying embers of the fire, the other men asleep in the adjoining rooms, she found herself telling him about her mother, the quiet, sad woman who had created this small, secret world. She was not like the others, Eleanor said, her voice a low, reflective whisper. She hated the balls, the parties, the endless empty rituals of our class. She loved books and music and the simple, quiet beauty of the world. This cottage, this was her true home. The great house, that was her prison. She looked at him, her eyes shining in the firelight. I am more my mother's daughter than my father's. I have been a prisoner my entire life, Sergeant. You did not abduct me. You liberated me. He listened in his usual thoughtful silence. Freedom is not a place, my lady, he said finally, his voice a gentle rumble. It is a state of mind. You were always free. You just had to choose to see the key that was in your own hand. And what of your freedom, Isaac? She asked, using his first name for the first time, the sound of it a soft, intimate thing in the quiet room. What will you do if we get out of this? Will you go back to your island? Back to the army? He was quiet for a long time, staring into the glowing embers. My island, he said, a note of deep, aching nostalgia in his voice, is no longer my home. It is a place of beauty, yes, but also of great poverty and little opportunity. It is why I joined the army, to see the world, to become a man of substance. And the army has taught me many things. It has taught me discipline and honor and the nature of men. But it has also shown me that there is a deep and terrible sickness in the heart of this empire I serve. A sickness of prejudice, of a belief that one man is better than another because of the color of his skin or the place of his birth. He turned to look at her, and his eyes held a fire she had not seen before. I have decided, he said, his voice low and intense, that I can no longer be a soldier in an army that fights for a tainted cause. When I am free, I will find a new way to fight. I will go to university. I will study the law. And I will use the law as a weapon to fight for the rights of my people, to fight for a world where a man is judged not by his birth, but by his character. She saw him then, not just as a soldier, not just as her protector, but as the man he was truly meant to be, a leader, a fighter for justice, a man of profound and unshakable conviction. And she, who had been raised to believe that love was a matter of contracts and alliances, felt a new and terrifying emotion unfurling in her heart. It was a feeling of such deep and soul-shaking connection to this man that it felt like coming home for the first time in her life. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp, urgent whisper from the doorway. It was the sentry. "Sergeant," he hissed, "there are lights on the main lane, a convoy of them, military trucks." Isaac was on his feet in an instant, the quiet philosopher replaced by the decisive, commanding soldier. He and Eleanor, followed by the other men, crept to the small, grimy window at the back of the cottage, which offered a slivered, distant view of the main service road. In the darkness, they could see them. A line of 3 army trucks, their headlights cutting through the night, were rumbling slowly toward the great house. The military police had arrived. The Duke had escalated the hunt. This was no longer a matter for gamekeepers and estate staff. This was a formal military operation. The net was closing. Their small, forgotten valley, their temporary fortress, would not remain hidden for much longer. They were running out of time. The arrival of the military police transformed the nature of their sanctuary. The cottage was no longer a refuge. It was a trap, a dead end in a valley from which there was no easy escape. The atmosphere inside, which had been one of tense but hopeful solidarity, now grew taut with a new, more immediate fear. Isaac's men, professional soldiers to the core, understood the implications perfectly. This was no longer a matter of evading civilian estate workers. They were now facing their own, a disciplined, relentless force that knew how to hunt men. Isaac gathered them in the main room, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows on their grim, determined faces. He was the calm center of their growing storm. "They will be systematic," he said, his voice a low, steadying force in the anxious silence. "They will establish a perimeter around the estate. They will conduct a grid search, section by section. It is only a matter of time before they find this valley, this cottage. We have, at most, 48 hours. His words were a death sentence for their current strategy of passive concealment. They could no longer hide. They had to move. But where and how? "We can't use the truck," said Corporal Sam, the quiet guitarist, his voice tight with worry. "They'll have roadblocks on every lane. We'd be caught before we went a mile." "We go on foot," Isaac said, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his men. "We go over the mountains. We leave everything behind that we cannot carry on our backs. We travel by night and hide by day. We are no longer an honor guard. We are a guerrilla unit." It was a soldier's solution, a plan born of his experience in the jungle campaigns of the Pacific. But Eleanor, who had been listening in silence, knew it was a flawed one. "And where will we go, Isaac?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through the military planning. "A group of 9 black soldiers and 1 white woman traveling on foot through the English countryside. We would be as conspicuous as a circus parade. The first farmer who sees us, the first village constable, will raise the alarm. We cannot outrun the entire country." She had identified the central, fatal flaw in his plan. Their greatest weakness was not the Duke's men or the military police. It was their own visibility, the fact that they were a group so far outside the norms of this insular, homogeneous society that they could not hope to blend in. Isaac looked at her, a flicker of grudging respect in his eyes. He had been thinking like a soldier, focused on the tactical problem of evasion. She was thinking like a strategist, focused on the larger political problem of their existence. "Do you have a better idea, my lady?" he asked, a hint of a challenge in his voice. "I do," she said, her voice gaining a new, confident authority. "We cannot go around the enemy, so we must go through them. We must use their own assumptions, their own prejudices against them." She walked to the large, dusty table in the center of the room and unrolled a detailed map of the Avington estate that she had found in her mother's desk. They will be searching the woods, the fields, the abandoned barns. They are looking for a group of fugitives hiding in the wilderness. They will not be looking for us in the one place we are not supposed to be. She placed her finger firmly on the map, on the grand, sprawling illustration of the main house. They will not be looking for us in Avington Park itself. A stunned silence fell over the room. The men looked at her as if she had gone completely mad. "My lady," Corporal Sam began, his voice a tone of gentle, respectful disbelief. "Forgive me, but that is the heart of the enemy's camp. It will be swarming with soldiers." "Precisely," Eleanor said, a strange, brilliant light in her eyes. "And that is why they will never expect it. My father's strategy is one of containment. He has thrown a net around the estate. He believes we are rats caught in his trap. He does not conceive of the possibility that the rats might be hiding in his own pantry." Her plan, as she laid it out, was one of breathtaking audacity. The great house, Avington Park, was a small city unto itself, with a vast labyrinthine network of service tunnels, forgotten storage rooms, and disused servants' quarters that dated back centuries. She, who had grown up exploring its secret passages as a child, knew its hidden geography better than anyone. "There is an old wine cellar," she explained, her finger tracing a path on the map, "that connects via a sealed tunnel to an ice house on the far side of the lake. It has not been used since my grandfather's time. The entrance is in the sub-basement, a part of the house the staff never goes to. We can hide there. We can live under their very noses." If her audacity was a source of strength, it was one that moved mountains. For Eleanor, the daughter of a duke, this moment of high-stakes strategy was not just a fight for survival. It was the ultimate act of self-realization. She was not a pawn in this game. She was a queen, and her courage was her most powerful piece. If Eleanor's courage in this moment has moved you, a super thanks is the most direct way to help us continue to honor souls as resilient as hers. Isaac listened, his expression a mixture of profound skepticism and a dawning, reluctant admiration. The plan was insane. It was a gamble of such epic proportions that it bordered on suicidal. But it was also brilliant. It was a plan that relied not on evasion, but on a deep psychological understanding of her enemy, of their arrogance, of their blind spots. "And how do we get from here to there?" he asked, his voice now that of a co-conspirator, a fellow general weighing the tactical risks of her grand strategy. "It is 5 miles, through terrain that will be actively patrolled." "That," she said, a small, cunning smile on her lips, "is where you and your men come in. We will use their own party against them." She pointed to a notation on the map. "Tomorrow night, my father is hosting his annual tenants' ball. It is a tradition, a piece of feudal pageantry, where he plays the role of the benevolent lord for the farmers and merchants who live on his land. The entire estate staff, the entire security force will be focused on the main house, on the party. The outer grounds will be less heavily patrolled. It is our window. The plan was set. They would move under the cover of the very festivities that were meant to celebrate the Duke's absolute power. They would use the noise and the distraction of the party to slip through the net. The next 24 hours were spent in a state of tense, focused preparation. They packed what little they could carry: food, water, and blankets. They burned anything that might betray their presence in the cottage, leaving it as a silent, empty shell. As darkness fell on the night of the ball, they began their journey. It was a slow, nerve-wracking infiltration. Isaac led the way, his movements silent and sure, his senses on high alert. Eleanor, who knew this land by heart, was his guide, pointing out the hidden paths, the natural cover. The other men moved behind them, a silent, disciplined file of shadows. In the distance, they could see the great house, a blaze of light and sound in the darkness. They could hear the faint, festive strains of a brass band. It was a surreal experience, creeping like fugitives through the darkness, while the world they had fled celebrated just a few miles away. They had to cross a wide, open meadow, a place that offered no cover. It was the most dangerous part of their journey. They crawled on their bellies through the wet grass, the lights of a distant patrol jeep sweeping the fields periodically. They froze, their faces pressed into the damp earth as the beams of light passed over them. Their hearts hearts pounding in the sudden, terrifying silence. But they made it. They reached the relative safety of the dense woods that surrounded the lake. And there, hidden in a thicket of rhododendrons, just as she had promised, was the old stone and earth mound of the ice house, its heavy, iron-banded door almost completely concealed by ivy. Using a crowbar one of the men had brought, they pried the rusted ancient lock from the door. It opened with a low, groaning complaint, releasing a gust of cold, musty air. They slipped inside, into the pitch-black subterranean cold. The tunnel was exactly where Eleanor had said it would be, a low, arched brick passageway at the back of the ice house, sealed not by a locked door, but by a section of wall that was, as she had remembered from her grandfather's stories, designed to be removed. It was a secret escape route, built by some long-dead paranoid ancestor. It took 4 of the men, their shoulders pressed against the damp brick to break the seal. The wall gave way with a grinding, tearing sound, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel that sloped down into the earth. They were in. They had breached the perimeter. They were now inside the enemy's fortress. Eleanor led them through the long, dark tunnel, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. After what felt like an eternity, they saw a faint line of light ahead. It was the door to the sub-basement. She turned the iron handle, and the door swung open into a vast, cavernous cellar, filled with the ghostly shapes of discarded furniture, forgotten trunks, and wine racks that held nothing but dust and cobwebs. They had made it. They were in the belly of the beast. They found a series of small, dry adjoining rooms, likely the old quarters for the cellar staff, and made their new, secret home. From their subterranean hiding place, they could hear the faint, muffled sounds of the world above, the distant rumble of the house's furnace, the clanging of pipes, and sometimes, if they were very quiet, the faint, ghostly echo of footsteps on the stone floors far above. They were living like ghosts, silent, invisible spectators in the life of the great house. The first, most dangerous phase of Eleanor's plan had succeeded. Now all they had to do was survive, undetected, for 3 more weeks, a lifetime in the silent, suffocating darkness beneath Avington Park. Life underground was a disorienting twilight existence, a world without sun or stars, where time was measured not by the clock, but by the faint, muffled rhythms of the great house above. The initial, adrenaline-fueled triumph of their successful infiltration slowly gave way to the grim, monotonous reality of their confinement. The sub-basement was a labyrinth of stone and shadow, a cold, damp, and profoundly lonely kingdom. Their days were spent in a state of enforced, whispering silence. They slept during the daylight hours, when the house above was most active, their bodies curled in blankets on the cold stone floors of the disused servants' quarters. Their nights were a period of tense, watchful activity. Under the cover of the house's deepest slumber, between the hours of 2 and 4 in the morning, they would emerge from their hiding place to forage for supplies. Isaac organized these missions with the same meticulous, silent precision he would have used for a nighttime raid on an enemy encampment. He and one other man, usually the quiet, agile Corporal Sam, would slip out of the sub-basement and into the vast, silent network of the house's lower levels. Eleanor, with her intimate knowledge of the house's geography, was their intelligence officer, drawing the maps from memory, marking the locations of the larders, the pantries, the coal bins. These nightly forays were fraught with a terrible, heart-stopping tension. Every creak of a floorboard, every groan of an old pipe was a potential alarm. They moved like ghosts through the cavernous kitchens and storerooms, their feet shod in rags to muffle their steps. They were thieves in Eleanor's own home, stealing loaves of bread, jars of preserves, and sacks of coal to keep their small fugitive community alive. They were living like rats in the walls of a palace, surviving on the scraps of a world of unimaginable plenty that was just a few floors above their heads. The psychological toll of their confinement was immense. The constant darkness, the enforced silence, the ever-present fear of discovery, it began to wear on them all. The easy camaraderie that had blossomed in the cottage now grew strained. The men, soldiers accustomed to action and open spaces, became restless, irritable. Minor disagreements flared into tense, whispered arguments. Their small, subterranean world felt like it was shrinking a little more each day. Isaac was the anchor that kept them from drifting into despair. He maintained a rigid military discipline, not through fear, but through the quiet, unshakable force of his own example. He organized a strict routine of duties, cleaning their small living space, maintaining their dwindling supplies, standing watch in shifts at the entrance to their tunnel. He initiated a regimen of physical exercise, leading the men in silent, strenuous workouts in the largest of the cellars to keep their bodies and their minds from atrophying. But it was Eleanor who provided the sustenance for their souls. She, who had been raised in a world of cultivated beauty, now used that knowledge to combat the oppressive ugliness of their confinement. She discovered a forgotten storage room filled with thousands of candles, and their small quarters were soon filled with a warm, gentle, flickering light. She found a crate of her mother's old phonograph records and a wind-up gramophone, and in the deepest hours of the night, the ghostly, scratchy sounds of a Mozart concerto or a Schubert sonata would fill their stone-walled prison, a fragile, beautiful act of defiance against the darkness. She and Isaac became the undisputed leaders of their small underground republic. Their partnership, a quiet, unspoken thing that was the true source of the group's resilience. He was the commander, the strategist, the provider of order and security. She was the heart, the provider of culture, of hope, of the small, essential reminders of the world of beauty they were fighting to rejoin. Their own relationship deepened in the enforced monastic intimacy of the cellar. Their conversations, held in low whispers in the quiet hours after the other men were asleep, became their own private world. He would tell her more of his home in the West Indies, of the vibrant colors, the rich smells, the deep communal bonds of his childhood. He spoke of his dream of the law not as an abstract ambition, but as a burning, personal calling. The law, in the hands of men like your father, is a cage, he told her one night, his voice a low, intense murmur. But in the right hands, it can be a key. I want to be a man who makes keys, Eleanor. Not for the rich, but for the men who are born into locked rooms. She, in turn, opened the locked rooms of her own heart. She spoke of the profound, crushing loneliness of her life, of the feeling of being a beautiful, prized object in a glass case, admired but never truly seen. You were the first person, she confessed, her voice thick with an emotion she could not name, who ever looked at me and saw a person, not a title, not a prize, not an alliance, just a person. The physical and emotional space between them shrank until it was almost non-existent. A shared glance across the candlelit room, the accidental brush of their hands as they passed in a narrow corridor. These small, fleeting moments were charged with a powerful, unspoken current, but they never crossed the final, invisible line. They were a commander, and his charge, a sergeant and a lady, and the rigid, formal structures of their old world, the very world they were rebelling against, still held a powerful sway. Their bond was one of deep, mutual respect and a growing but unacknowledged love. It was a love that was too precious and too dangerous to be spoken aloud in the darkness. Their time in the cellar was a long, slow countdown. They marked the days by scratching lines on the stone wall, a calendar of their confinement. 2 weeks passed, then 3. The date of the regiment's departure was drawing near. Their audacious gamble seemed to be working. The search on the estate above had been scaled back. The military police, having found no trace of the fugitives, were assumed to have moved their search to the wider countryside. But their supplies were running dangerously low. The canned goods were nearly gone. They were down to their last sack of coal. They were growing weaker, their faces paler in the candlelight. The end of their ordeal was in sight, but it was a race against time. The crisis came on a night just 3 days before the ship was due to sail. Isaac and Corporal Sam Sam were on their final, most desperate foraging mission. They had to go further into the house than ever before, to the main larders, a place that was dangerously close to the staff quarters. Eleanor and the other men waited in the tense, silent darkness of the cellar. An hour passed, then two. Isaac and Sam were disciplined, efficient. A mission should never have taken this long. A cold, creeping fear began to settle over Eleanor, and then they heard it. It was not a loud noise. It was a faint, muffled shout from somewhere far above, followed by the sound of a slamming door and running footsteps. The men in the cellar froze, their faces turning to Eleanor, their eyes wide with a silent, terrible question. "They've been caught!" whispered one of the men, his voice a choked, panicked sound. The thought was a shard of ice in Eleanor's heart. Isaac, captured. Her mind reeled with the implications. If he was caught, he would be court-martialed, he would be imprisoned, and he would never, ever betray their hiding place. He would take the fall alone. The plan, their desperate, brilliant plan, had failed at the final hurdle. Panic, cold and absolute, threatened to overwhelm her. But then she looked at the faces of the other soldiers, at their fear, at their despair, and she knew she could not fall apart. Isaac was gone. She was in command now. She had to think. She had to act. "We don't know that he's been caught," she said, her voice a forced, steady calm that she did not feel. There could have been 100 reasons for that noise. An argument, a dropped tray. "We will not panic. We will stick to the plan. We wait." Isaac's orders were to wait for his return or for a signal. Her words, her calm, her assumption of command had a steadying effect on the men. They were soldiers. They were trained to obey a chain of command. And in the absence of their sergeant, Lady Eleanor Vance, the strange, aristocratic woman who had led them into this madness, had become their commanding officer. They waited. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Every creak of the house above, every distant, unidentifiable sound was a fresh wave of terror. Eleanor's mind was a battlefield. She imagined Isaac in chains, being dragged before her father. She imagined him in a dark, cold military cell. The thought of his capture, of his sacrifice for her, was a pain so profound it was physical. And then a new sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the pipes that ran along the ceiling of the cellar. Tap, 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 pause. Tap, tap, tap. It was a code, a signal. One of the soldiers, a former signals officer, looked at her, his eyes wide with a dawning, incredulous hope. "It's Morse code," he whispered. He put his ear to the pipe, his face a mask of intense concentration, his finger tapping out the rhythm on his knee as he translated. The message was short, just 3 words. "They know. Run." The blood drained from Eleanor's face. They had not been caught, but they had been discovered. Someone in the house knew they were there. The game was over. The trap was about to be sprung, and Isaac, her brave, honorable Isaac, was out there, somewhere in the house, a fugitive, trying to warn them, trying to save them, even as the net closed around him. The 3 coded words, tapped out on a cold iron pipe, were a death knell and a call to arms all at once. "They know. Run." The message was stark, terrifying, and unambiguous. Their sanctuary had become their tomb, and the walls were closing in. For a moment, a stunned, terrified paralysis gripped the small group in the cellar. The logical military response was to obey the order, to flee through the icehouse tunnel and scatter into the night. But Eleanor knew with a woman's intuitive certainty that it was already too late. If they knew, then the tunnel, their only escape route, would be the first place a watch would be set. To run now would be to run directly into the arms of the waiting soldiers, and there was another, more powerful imperative that held her rooted to the spot. Isaac was still out there. He and Sam had been discovered, and instead of saving themselves, they had chosen to send a warning. They had sacrificed their own chance of escape to give the others a fighting chance. She could not, would not, abandon them. To run now would be an act of cowardice so profound it would negate everything she had fought for, everything she had become. "No," she said, her voice a low, clear command that cut through the panicked indecision of the men. "We are not running. We are not leaving them behind." The The soldiers stared at her, their expressions a mixture of awe and disbelief. She was a civilian, a lady of title, but in that moment, she was a more decisive commander than any they had ever served under. "Isaac is a soldier," she continued, her mind racing, a new, desperate and utterly insane plan beginning to form. "He will not surrender. He will fight, or he will find a new place to hide within the house. We cannot get out, so we must go up. We must go to them." "Go to them, my lady?" one of the men asked, his voice a choked, incredulous whisper. "That's suicide." "No," she said, a strange, fierce light in her eyes. "It is the last thing they will ever expect. They are hunting for a group of fugitive soldiers in the cellars and on the grounds. They are not expecting to find the Duke's daughter in her own home, demanding an audience with her father." She looked at the small, loyal band of men who had followed her into this madness. "You are soldiers of the king. You were brought here to this house as an honor guard. Until someone proves otherwise, that is what you are. And I am Lady Eleanor Vance. This is my home. We are not going to scurry out of here like rats. We are going to walk out the front door." It was a gamble of such breathtaking audacity that for a moment no one spoke. She was proposing to turn their entire situation on its head, to transform themselves from cowering fugitives into righteous, aggrieved parties. It was a bluff, a piece of magnificent aristocratic theater, and it was the only weapon they had left. "All right," she said, her voice now crisp, authoritative. "Here is what we are going to do." For the next 10 minutes, she laid out her plan. It was a plan that relied on surprise, on psychology, and on the rigid, class-bound assumptions of the very people who were hunting them. The men, their own fear now replaced by a kind of awe-struck admiration for her sheer, unmitigated nerve, listened and nodded, their military minds recognizing the brilliant, unconventional logic of her strategy. When she was done, she turned and walked to one of the old, forgotten trunks that lined the cellar walls. It was a trunk filled with her own mother's things she had not seen since she was a child. She threw it open. The scent of cedar and old potpourri filled the air. She rummaged through the layers of silk and lace and found what she was looking for: a simple, elegant, dark velvet traveling dress. "One cannot confront one's father in a servant's frock," she said, a small, grim smile touching her lips. In the flickering candlelight of the cellar, she transformed. She shed the simple, practical dress of the fugitive and donned the dark, regal velvet of the aristocrat. She piled her hair on top of her head in a severe, elegant chignon. When she was done, she was no longer their co-conspirator. She was Lady Eleanor Vance, and she looked every inch the part. She then turned to the men. "Your uniforms," she said. "They must be perfect." In a flurry of activity, the men helped each other brush the dust and the grime from their dress uniforms. They polished their brass buttons until they gleamed. They straightened their insignia. They were no longer a band of ragged guerrillas. They were, once again, the king's honor guard. "Now," she said when they were ready, "we go." She led them, not to the tunnel, but to a different, steeper set of stairs at the far end of the cellar. A staircase she knew led up to the main kitchen pantry. She walked with her head held high, her back straight, the very picture of aristocratic grace and command. Her heart was a frantic, terrified bird in her chest, but she did not let it show. She opened the door at the top of the stairs and stepped out into the bright, cavernous space of the main kitchen. Two kitchen maids, who were preparing an early breakfast, looked up and screamed, dropping a tray of crockery with a loud, shattering crash. They stared at her, and at the file of immaculate, grim-faced black soldiers who emerged from the pantry behind her, as if they had seen a host of avenging angels or demons rise up from the very floors of the house. Eleanor did not pause. She did not explain. She swept past them, her velvet dress whispering on the stone floor. "Inform the Duke," she said, her voice cold and imperious, to the stunned, gaping face of the head butler, who had come running at the sound of the crash, "that his daughter is in the morning room, and that she requires a word with him, immediately." She led her honor guard through the silent, sleeping house, her footsteps echoing in the grand, baronial halls. They were a bizarre, impossible procession, a spectre from a dream or a nightmare. She walked into the morning room, a beautiful sun-drenched space where her family took their breakfast, and she stood by the fireplace, arranging her soldiers in a formal ceremonial line behind behind her. And then she waited. It did not take long. The house was now buzzing with a panicked, frantic energy. She could hear the sound of running footsteps, of hushed, urgent voices. A moment later, the door to the morning room burst open. Her father, the Duke, stood there, his face a mask of thunderous, apoplectic rage. He was still in his dressing gown, and behind him, looking grim and professional, were two uniformed military police officers. "Eleanor!" the Duke roared, his voice shaking with a fury so profound it was almost animalistic. "What is the meaning of this? You are under arrest, all of you." Eleanor did not flinch. She met her father's gaze with a look of cool, appraising disdain that was a perfect mirror of his own aristocratic arrogance. "On the contrary, father," she said, her voice a silken, chilling calm. "I believe it is you who has some explaining to do. I have just spent the last 3 weeks as a virtual prisoner in the sub-basement of my own home, hiding from your thugs and your military police. I have been living in a state of terror, protected only by the loyalty and the honor of these fine soldiers of the king, who were themselves forced into this intolerable position by the ungentlemanly conduct of your house guest, Lord Harrington." The Duke stared at her, speechless. She had taken his narrative, his story of a disobedient daughter and a fugitive soldier, and she had completely, audaciously rewritten it. In her version, she was the victim, and Isaac and his men were her noble protectors. Furthermore, she continued, her voice rising with a righteous, theatrical indignation, "I have just learned that 2 of these brave men, Sergeant Thorne and Corporal Sam, were accosted and set upon by your staff in the kitchens while attempting to secure provisions for me. I demand to know where they are. I demand that they be released. And I demand an explanation for why my home has been turned into a prison, and why loyal soldiers of the crown are being treated like common criminals under my own roof." She had seized the initiative completely. She was no longer on the defensive. She was on the attack. The military police officers, who had been prepared to arrest a band of fugitives, now looked confused, their hands hovering uncertainly near their holsters. They were caught in the crossfire of a battle between 2 of the most powerful aristocrats in the country, and they had no idea whose orders to follow. The Duke, for the first time in his life, was at a loss. He was a man who understood the world in terms of clear, simple hierarchies, of orders given and orders obeyed. His daughter's insane, brilliant counter-offensive had thrown his entire world into chaos. He sputtered, trying to regain control. This is preposterous. You will not. I am the Duke. You will." It was at that moment that a new figure appeared in the doorway. It was Isaac. He was not in chains. He was flanked by 2 more of the Duke's private security men, but he was not their prisoner. He was their escort, and with him, his face pale and his arm in a makeshift sling, was Corporal Sam. Isaac's eyes met Eleanor's across the room. There was a flicker of profound, awestruck admiration in his gaze. He had sent a message to run, and she had responded by capturing the castle. "Sergeant Thorne!" the Duke roared, finding a target for his fury. "You are under arrest for desertion, for insubordination, for the abduction of my daughter." Isaac came to a halt in the center of the room. He gave the Duke a slow, formal, and perfectly executed salute. "Your Grace," he said, his voice a calm, resonant baritone that filled the room with a new, quiet authority. "I have not deserted my post. I have been fulfilling my duty. My duty as a soldier and as a man of honor was to protect Lady Eleanor, who was in a state of great distress and who feared for her safety in this house. We have remained on the estate, under her protection and her command." He then looked at the 2 military police officers. "I and my men are prepared to submit a full report of the events of the last 3 weeks to our commanding officer, a report that will include a detailed account of Lord Harrington's assault on my person and of the inhospitable conditions that forced a lady of the realm to seek refuge in her own cellars. The threat was clear, and it was devastating. He was not going to allow this to be handled quietly. He was going to make this a formal, public military matter. A matter that would involve sworn testimony, a public inquiry, and a scandal that would not just embarrass the Duke, but would drag the names of Avington and Harrington through the mud of every tabloid in London. The Duke stood there, trapped. His own daughter had outmaneuvered him. A colonial sergeant had outgeneraled him. He had lost control of the narrative, of the situation, of his own house. He was a king who had been checkmated in his own throne room by a pawn and a queen. He looked from his defiant daughter to the calm, resolute soldier, and he knew with a final, crushing certainty that he had been defeated. The tense tableau in the morning room held for a long, silent moment, a frozen portrait of a dynasty in crisis. The Duke of Avington, a man who had commanded armies and advised kings, was for the first time in his life utterly and completely outmaneuvered. He was trapped between the unyielding defiance of his own daughter and the quiet, iron-willed dignity of a soldier who refused to be broken. His weapons of choice, authority, outrage, and the brute force of his title were useless. He was a proud man, but he was not a stupid one. He understood the art of the strategic retreat. He knew that to press the attack now, to arrest Isaac and his men, would be to ignite a public scandal of catastrophic proportions. The story Eleanor and Isaac were presenting, however preposterous, was a brilliant and defensible position. It was the word of a duke's daughter and a decorated sergeant against the word of a hot-headed, jilted suitor. In the court of public opinion, a battle he had never before had to fight, the outcome was dangerously uncertain. With a visible, almost physical effort, the Duke reined in his fury. He composed his features into a mask of cold, regal authority. "Major," he said, his voice a low, gravelly command, addressing the senior of the two military police officers. "It appears there has been a misunderstanding, a grave one. This is a private family matter. Your presence is no longer required." He turned his back on them, a clear, contemptuous dismissal. "You and your men will withdraw from my estate. I will speak to your commanding general myself." The major, a man clearly relieved to be extricated from this aristocratic minefield, did not hesitate. He gave a curt, formal nod. "Yes, Your Grace." He and his subordinate turned and exited the room, their retreat a quiet, tacit admission of the Duke's restored, if fragile, authority. The Duke then turned his cold, furious gaze upon his daughter, Eleanor. "To my study, now." He then looked at Isaac and the men arrayed behind him. "You, Sergeant, and your men, you will wait here. You will not move. You will not speak. You will wait for my judgment." With that, he turned and strode from the room, his silk dressing gown swirling around him like a battle cloak. Eleanor gave Isaac one last, quick, unreadable look, a silent acknowledgement of the new, even more dangerous phase of the battle that was about to begin. Then she followed her father. The Duke's study was the heart of his power, a dark, wood-paneled room that smelled of leather, cigar smoke, and 1,000 years of accumulated authority. He did not invite her to sit. He stood behind his massive baronial desk, a king on his throne, and fixed her with a look of such cold, concentrated fury that it was a physical force. "Do you have any idea what you have done?" he began, his voice a low, controlled tremor. "You have not just embarrassed me. You have not just created a scandal. You have jeopardized the very foundations of this family. An alliance with the Harringtons would have secured our financial and political future for a generation. You have thrown that away for what? A moment of childish rebellion? A sordid infatuation with a colonial foot soldier?" "It was not an infatuation, Father," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but steady. She would not be intimidated. She had come too far for that. "It was a choice. You and Lord Harrington were discussing my future as if I were a parcel of land. You left me no choice but to remind you that I am a person with a will of my own." "A will?" The Duke scoffed, his voice dripping with scorn. "You are the daughter of a duke. Your will is to do your duty, to your name, to your family, to the class you were born into. That is the price of the privilege you enjoy." "And what a privilege it is," she shot back, a bitter irony lacing her voice. the privilege of being sold to the highest bidder, the privilege of a life of quiet, gilded servitude. I have watched you, Father. I have watched you move the pieces on your chessboard, your land, your money, your tenants, your own daughter. But you seem to have forgotten that sometimes the pawns have a mind of their own. Her defiance, her refusal to be cowed, seemed to momentarily stun him. He had expected tears, apologies, a plea for forgiveness. He had not expected this cool, articulate stranger who stood before him. And this soldier, he spat, changing his line of attack, this thorn, do you truly believe he is your noble protector, your selfless champion, or is he a clever, ambitious upstart who saw an opportunity and seized it? He is a colonial, Eleanor, a man from the fringes of the empire. He sees you, and he sees a ladder, a way to climb into a world he could only dream of. And you, in your foolish, romantic naivety, have handed him the first rung. You are wrong, she said, her voice a low, fierce whisper. You are wrong about him, because you cannot conceive of a man who is not motivated by the same things that motivate you. Power, acquisition, advantage. Isaac Thorne is a man of honor, a concept I fear has become a foreign language in this house. Honor, the Duke laughed, a short, ugly, humorless sound. Honor is a luxury for poets and fools. In the real world there is only power, and you have just handed a great deal of it to a man you do not know. A man who will, I assure you, use it for his own ends. He sat down heavily in his leather chair, the fight seeming to go out of him, replaced by a cold, pragmatic weariness. He was no longer a furious father, but a strategist, assessing the damage and calculating his next move. What is it you want, Eleanor? He asked, his voice flat. You have won. You have created a situation so scandalous, so potentially damaging, that I have no choice but to negotiate with you. So tell me, what are your terms? She had not expected this sudden, cold capitulation. She had been prepared for a battle of wills, not a negotiation. But she recognized the opening he had given her. It was a chance not just to save Isaac, but to win her own, true freedom. First, she said, her voice clear and strong, you will see to it that all charges, all inquiries against Sergeant Thorne and his men are dropped immediately. There will be no court-martial. There will be no punishment. They will be allowed to rejoin their regiment and to leave this country with their honor, their rank, and their records intact. The Duke nodded slowly. That can be arranged. A quiet word with the general. It will be untidy, but it can be done. Second, she continued, Lord Harrington, he will offer a formal public apology to Sergeant Thorne for his unprovoked assault and for his slanderous accusations. The Duke's eyes widened. That is impossible. A Harrington does not apologize, especially not to a colonial. Then he will find that his family's business dealings, which are so closely intertwined with our own, will suddenly face a series of unfortunate and expensive complications, she said, her voice as cold and as ruthless as his own. She was using his language now, the language of power and leverage. I believe you called it a sound investment, Father. An apology is a small price to pay to maintain a profitable alliance. He stared at her, a look of grudging, almost horrified admiration on his face. She was his daughter, after all. And for yourself? He asked. What is your price, Eleanor? She took a deep breath. This was the most important move of all. My freedom, she said simply. I will no longer be a piece on your chessboard. The engagements, the alliances, the mergers, they are over. I will choose my own life. I will choose my own husband if and when I decide to marry, or I will choose not to. The decision will be mine, and mine alone. And if I refuse, he asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl, then I will leave, she said, her voice quiet but absolute. I will walk out of this house, and I will not come back. And I will take the story of the last 3 weeks with me. I will tell it to every newspaper in London. The story of the Duke's daughter, held prisoner in her own home, of the brave colonial soldiers who protected her, of the corrupt, entitled aristocrats who sought to destroy them. I will become the biggest, most ruinous scandal this family has ever known. And your precious name, your legacy, will be a laughingstock for generations. She had him, and they both knew it. She had learned his game, and she had beaten him at it. He was silent for a long, long time. He looked at the woman his daughter had become, at this fierce, intelligent, and utterly implacable stranger, and he made the only choice a man like him could make. He surrendered. "Very well," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "You have my word." An hour later, Sergeant Isaac Thorne and his men were standing at attention in the grand entrance hall. The Duke stood before them, his face a mask of stone. "Sergeant," he said, his voice cold and formal, "there has been a full review of the recent regrettable events. It has been determined that you and your men acted with honor and discipline in a manner befitting your regiment in the protection of my daughter, Lady Eleanor. You are to be commended. All official inquiries are now closed. You will be escorted back to your barracks, where you will rejoin your unit. You are dismissed." It was a complete and total victory. The men, their faces a mixture of relief and stunned disbelief, gave a final sharp salute. As they were turning to leave, the great front doors opened. Lord Harrington stood on the threshold. His face was pale, his expression a mask of pure, unadulterated humiliation. He walked directly to Isaac, his movements stiff, robotic. He stopped in front of him. He did not meet his eyes. "Sergeant Thorne," he said, his voice a low, choked mumble. "I wish to apologize for my actions on the night of the ball. My behavior was unpardonable. I offer you my sincerest regrets." He then turned on his heel and strode away, a man who had been broken, his pride shattered. The last of the debts had been paid. Isaac and his men were free. They marched out of the house, their heads held high, their honor restored. As Isaac was about to step into the waiting army truck, Eleanor appeared at the door. She came down the steps and stood before him. "You are leaving," she said, her voice a quiet statement of fact. "My ship sails in 2 days," he said, "back to my home." The chasm between their worlds, which had been so briefly and so violently bridged, now seemed to yawn open again, wider and more impassable than ever. He was a soldier going home. She was a duke's daughter who had won her freedom, but was still a prisoner of her own world. "Will you write to me?" she asked, her voice a small, vulnerable whisper. "I will," he said. "And will you come back?" she asked, her heart in her eyes. He looked at her, at this beautiful, courageous, and utterly impossible woman. He thought of his own dreams, of the law, of the new fight that lay before him, and he thought of the world that lay between them. "The law is a long and difficult road, Eleanor," he said, his voice soft with a deep, aching regret. "It may take me many years. It may take me to a place where a man like me can build a life that is worthy of a woman like you." It was not a promise, it was not a refusal, it was the simple, heartbreaking truth. He gave her a final, slow salute. Then he climbed into the truck and did not look back. Eleanor stood on the steps of her grand, empty house and watched as the truck drove down the long gravel drive and disappeared from her life, leaving her with her newfound freedom and a silence that was more profound and more complete than any she had ever known. The silence that descended upon Avington Park in the wake of Isaac Thorne's departure was a heavy, suffocating thing. Eleanor had won her freedom, but the victory felt hollow, a Pyrrhic triumph that had cost her the only thing she had come to realize she truly valued. She was no longer a pawn in her father's dynastic games, but she was now the solitary queen of a vast, empty kingdom, a prisoner of a different, more subtle kind of cage. Her life, which had been a whirlwind of high-stakes drama and secret rebellion, now settled into a monotonous, grey calm. She had her freedom, but she did not know what to do with it. She refused the endless invitations to the balls and parties of the London season, finding the brittle gaiety and shallow conversations of her own class more unbearable than ever. She spent her days in her mother's forgotten cottage, reading the books Isaac had read aloud, her only companions, the ghosts of their brief, impossible time together. Her father, the Duke, treated her with a new, cold and formal distance. They were like two opposing monarchs who had negotiated a truce, their relationship now governed by a treaty of non-interference. He did not speak of marriage. He did not speak of her duty. He simply left her alone, his silence a constant, quiet reproach. True to his word, Isaac wrote. His first letter arrived a month after he had left, postmarked from his home island of Jamaica. His letters were not passionate declarations of love. They were quiet, thoughtful, and deeply respectful chronicles of his new life. He wrote of the vibrant, shocking colors of his homeland, of the warmth of the sun, of the comfort of being surrounded by his own family. He wrote of his decision to leave the army and of his acceptance into Howard University in America, a historically black college where he would begin his study of the law. His letters were a lifeline, a thin, fragile thread connecting her world of silent, aristocratic decay to his world of struggle, ambition, and a fierce, forward-looking hope. She would read and reread them, tracing the lines of his strong, clear handwriting, her heart aching with a mixture of pride and a profound sense of loss. She wrote back, her own letters a carefully edited account of her quiet, empty life. She did not write of her loneliness. She did not write of the fact that his name was a constant, silent presence in her thoughts. She wrote of books she had read, of the changing of the seasons at Avington Park, of her work with the War Orphans charity, a cause she had thrown herself into with a new, desperate energy. Their correspondence was a formal, almost academic exchange between two people from different worlds, but beneath the surface of their polite, respectful words, a deep and powerful current of unspoken emotion continued to flow. 2 years passed. 2 years of letters, of a long-distance friendship that was a constant, quiet torture for Eleanor. She watched from afar as he threw himself into his studies, his letters now filled with the exciting, challenging language of legal theory, of civil rights, of the burgeoning struggle for equality in America. He was becoming the man he had promised he would become, a fighter, a leader. And she was still Lady Eleanor Vance, a beautiful, intelligent, and utterly useless ornament in a decaying world. The pressure from her father, which had been dormant, began to subtly reassert itself. He did not command her to marry, but he began to parade a new, more carefully selected series of suitors before her. They were no longer the arrogant fools like Harrington. They were sober, intelligent men, men of industry and politics, men who he thought might appeal to her newfound seriousness. She met them with a polite, impenetrable indifference. Her heart was a locked room, and the key was 1,000 miles away, in the hands of a man who had never asked for it. The crisis, when it came, was not about her, but about the very foundations of her world. The post-war Labour government, with its socialist agenda, had begun to implement a series of sweeping land reforms and inheritance taxes designed to break the back of the old aristocracy. Avington Park, which had stood for 1,000 years as an unshakable symbol of her family's power, was now under threat. The Duke, who had weathered wars and political upheavals, now faced an enemy he could not defeat, the tax man. He was, for the first time in his life, in financial trouble. He was land-rich but cash-poor, his entire fortune tied up in the vast, unproductive estate. He grew older, grayer, more withdrawn. The weight of his dying world was crushing him. Eleanor, who had spent 2 years in a state of self-imposed exile from her father's affairs, now found herself drawn back in. She began to study the estate's books, the complex, archaic ledgers that chronicled 1,000 years of wealth. And she, with her sharp, intelligent mind, saw the problem with a clarity that her father, blinded by tradition and pride, could not. The estate was dying because it was a museum, a relic. It was not a functioning modern enterprise. An idea, radical and transformative, began to form in her mind. It was an idea born of Isaac's quiet pragmatism, of his belief in building, in creating, in turning the tools of the old world to a new purpose. She went to her father in his study. He was sitting at his desk, a stack of threatening letters from the government's tax office before him, his face a mask of grey, defeated despair. "Father," she began, her voice quiet but firm, "I have a proposal." She laid out her plan. It was a plan of such radical, revolutionary vision that it was, in its own way, as shocking as her rebellion on the terrace had been. She proposed to save Avington Park by dismantling it. She proposed to turn the vast, unproductive tracts of farmland over to a cooperative, to be run by the tenant farmers themselves, with the estate retaining a share of the profits. She proposed to open the great house, the monument to their own irrelevance, to the public, to turn its history and its art into a source of income. And she proposed to use a portion of the estate to build a new, modern and self-sustaining community, a village with schools and shops and affordable housing, a place for the soldiers who were coming home from the war with no place to go. The Duke stared at her as if she were speaking a foreign language. "You are proposing to turn Avington Park into a tourist attraction," he said, his voice a choked, incredulous whisper, "to give away our land to common farmers. It is unthinkable. It is the only way to survive, father," she said, her voice filled with a passionate, irrefutable logic. "The world has changed. We can no longer afford to be a museum. We must become a part of the living, breathing world again. We must use our privilege not to hoard our past, but to invest in the future." In their future, he refused, of course. The idea was a violation of every principle he held dear. But as the weeks went on, as the letters from the government grew more threatening, as the reality of his own impending ruin became undeniable, he began to listen. He saw the intelligence in her plan, the cold, hard, economic sense of it, and he saw in his daughter a leader, a strategist, a woman with a vision that was as pragmatic and as ruthless as his own. Slowly, reluctantly, he began to cede control. He allowed her to meet with the tenant farmers. He allowed her to bring in agricultural experts, city planners. He watched, a silent, skeptical ghost in his own house, as she began the slow, arduous and revolutionary process of transforming their dying feudal estate into a modern, thriving community. It was the hardest work of her life. She faced resistance from all sides, from the stubborn traditionalist farmers, from the resentful local gentry, from the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the government. But she persevered, her resolve hardened by her years of quiet struggle, her vision sharpened by Isaac's long-distance inspiration. She was no longer a damsel in a tower. She was a builder, a creator, a queen who was rebuilding her kingdom from the ground up. 3 more years passed. Isaac had graduated from Howard at the top of his class. His letters now came from New York, where he had joined a small, struggling law firm that specialized in civil rights cases. He was in the heart of the fight, a young, brilliant soldier in the long, slow war for justice. His name was beginning to be whispered in the legal circles of America as a man to watch. Eleanor's project, against all odds, was a stunning success. The farming cooperative was profitable. The Great House was one of the most popular tourist destinations in the country, and the new village, Avington Newtown, was a model of post-war community development, a thriving, integrated place where veterans and their families were building new lives. She had saved her family's legacy, not by preserving it in amber, but by transforming it into something new, something vital, something that served the future instead of worshipping the past. She and her father had found a new, quiet and profound respect for each other. He was still the Duke, but she was the true power behind the throne, the architect of their survival. One autumn afternoon, 5 years after Isaac had sailed away, she was in her small office in the newly converted stable block, going over the accounts for a new school they were building. There was a knock on her door. "Come in," she said, without looking up. The door opened. "I was told," a low, familiar and achingly missed voice said, "that I might find a lady in need of a good lawyer." Eleanor's head snapped up. Her heart stopped. He was standing in the doorway. He was older, his face leaner, more mature, but the calm, intelligent light in his eyes was the same. He was not wearing a uniform. He was wearing a simple, well-made suit. He looked like a man of substance, a man who had found his place in the world. He was Isaac Thorne, Esquire. She stood up, her legs unsteady, 1,000 unspoken words, 1,000 lonely nights, 1,000 hopeless dreams, all rushing to the surface. He walked into the room and stopped in front of her. "I finished my road, Eleanor," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "It has led me back to you." He had made no promises. He had offered no guarantees. He had simply gone out into the world and become the man he had told her he would be, a man worthy of her. And now he had returned. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply stepped into his arms, a place she had only ever been in her dreams, and she knew, with a certainty that was as profound and as deep as the roots of the ancient oaks of Avington Park, that she was finally, truly home. Your generous support through Super Thanks ensures that the fire of these powerful memories will never be extinguished. Thank you.